Hello, everyone. Good to be here with you this morning or afternoon or evening or wherever you are. My name is Simon Lester. I will be your moderator for this roundtable on carbon border adjustments. For as long as I can remember in my professional life, climate change mitigation measures have seemed like they're about to emerge as the next big thing in the trade regime, but then they never quite do. Governments talk a big game about what they might do or promise to do in this area, but what they actually do has tended to be much less, and that has kept the trade peace. On the other hand, it has been a disappointment in the climate arena. And of course, some political leaders who shall remain nameless thought climate change was a big hoax. But now it really feels like this time is different, that something is about to happen. Some of the big trade powers seem like they're taking climate change seriously and are about to take significant actions. And if they do so, that could finally lead to some of the trade issues we've been worrying about all these years. I don't want to say trade conflicts because I don't think it has to be, so let's just stick with issues, although realistically speaking, there's likely to be some conflict. And one of these issues is carbon border adjustments. This roundtable will consider various aspects of these measures. Some questions we will address are, can the EU and the US coordinate action? There seems to be emerging peace between the two in other areas. Can that be extended to climate change issues? In contrast with China, there's an emerging trade war or some sort of conflict. Will climate change measures constitute another front in that war? Or could it be a chance for cooperation? Could it actually have a calming effect? And where does the rest of the world, including developing countries, fit into all of this? We'll also talk about institutional questions, like what exactly is the WTO's role here? The world needs to coordinate the efforts in this area, but what's the right forum? And we'll look at how domestic measures affect trade and how they will interact with the trade regime. Can border adjustment mechanisms be designed so as to be consistent with WTO rules? What are the possible areas of conflict? And we can't possibly have this discussion without the infamous PPM issue. So of course, we'll talk about how domestic measures targeting how products are produced. And it's not just about production. We'll also cover how products are transported around the world. So the way we'll proceed is we'll have brief initial statements of 6 minutes or so from each person. So we're going to start with Chiara Galiffa of the European Commission, who will provide background and rationale for the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, and the main features of that proposal. We'll then go to Tatiana Prazeres of the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Tatiana will talk about the role of the WTO in supporting international efforts towards a low-carbon economy. And she'll also talk about if and how the EU CBAM could help trigger a discussion of global parameters for carbon and trade in the WTO. Then we'll turn to Joel Trachtman of the Fletcher School at Tufts University, who will talk about recognition arrangements in border tax adjustment mechanisms and the potential WTO restrictions that would apply to those arrangements. We'll then turn to James Nedumpara of the Center for Trade and Investment Law at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. James will talk about WTO-related issues concerning the operation of a possible carbon adjustment regime relating to transportation sectors and issues related to freedom of transit under GATT Article 5. And finally, we'll then turn to Thomas Cottier of the World Trade Institute, who will talk about the role of tariffs and PPMs and climate change mitigation as an alternative approach. So after their initial statement, I'll have some questions for the panelists, and we'll also have time for audience questions. So if you think of a good one as you're listening, please submit it in the Q&A part of the platform, and we'll try to fit it in. So with that, let me turn to Chiara and for her discussion of the EU CBAM. Let's make sure that she's not there. I don't see her. And if I don't see her, I'm going to move ahead to Tatiana.
Okay.
Anyone see?
Well,
yeah. Go ahead, Tatiana.
Are you sure? Yeah, I'm ready.
Well, I don't see her, so I think we better just move along and bring her back in as soon as she shows up.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Simon. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure. It's an honor, actually, and a big responsibility with great specialists in the area. I thought I could maybe talk a bit about the role of the WTO in this discussion. And a lot of attention has been devoted to the EU CBAM, and I think it's right, given what it means, the consequences of that. And I think it's also natural that WTO members and experts discuss the consistency of the EU proposal with WTO rules. I think that is very much important and needed. I think I would like to make a different point here, that which relates to the to what could play national efforts towards a low carbon economy. Actually, the point is that what drives me is this: how can the discussion about the EU CBAM can help trigger a conversation about carbon and trade in the WTO? How can we harness this energy and also discuss what is that the WTO can do to help fight climate change? I'm not saying that the discussion about the EU mechanism is not important. It is very important. My point is, how can we build on that to foster a global discussion in the WTO about CBAM or other means to address climate change? It's interesting to think that a global minimum tax rate to multinational corporations also seem unrealistic until very recently. So why not a global understanding on trade and climate change in the WTO? Proposal, in the same way that the discussion about digital tax can help trigger a more serious is being discussed forever, but maybe now it's the time for members to engage because something big is coming up. My starting point is that the existing approach, the existing WTO approach for trade and climate change, it's not only insufficient, it is inadequate. The approach is the one is basically one that says, well, trade rules don't harm, don't limit a country's ability to fight climate change, right? So WTO rules do not stand in the way. And I think that that's not enough anymore, right? The WTO has to take a more active role. The WTO has to serve as a building block in global efforts to fight climate change. So how can the discussions about the EU CBAM help? I think we are learning from the EU experience, or the experience with the EU. Any climate-related measure impacting trade should be discussed openly, should be accompanied by consultations with members. That transparency, accountability, non-discrimination, all this matters. That the mechanism does not serve to disguise protectionism, to consistent, of course. That there should be an exchange of information, of best practices, of ideas about how to address these issues. I think we should on that and somehow try to have a more structured discussion in the WTO. And I think the good news is that members are somehow trying to deal with that. So there is this trade and environmental sustainability structured discussion. Last year, the first meeting happened this year, and there was some of the issues that this subset of members want to discuss is, of course, trade and climate change, decarbonizing supply chains, circular economy, fossil fuel subsidies, and of course, carbon adjustment, border carbon adjustment measures. So there is a forum in the WTO for more focused discussions on this matter. Of course, existing committees also remain relevant, but the fact there's a group of members willing to discuss that is already very positive. The environment, of course, we all know that there was an attempt to agree on an environmental goods agreement that failed in the but well, maybe there's interest among some, not all, to resume that discussion, maybe including services now, environmental services, green investment. That is positive. But I think more critically, including because of the imminent EU CBAM, I think WTO members should discuss convergence, maybe mutual recognition of national efforts, emission trading schemes or carbon taxes. What is that members are already doing that should be taken into account if we want a minimum degree of convergence? Because in the absence of genuine efforts towards some, what we will see, I think, is a proliferation of unilateral measures and potential countermeasures that will not help trade, and more than that, will prevent trade from playing a constructive, a positive role towards fighting climate change. So these are my initial remarks here.
Lester, you're muted.
I was muted. Yeah, so thank you, Tatiana. That's great kickoff remarks. We're still trying to get Chiara and James back on. We'll try to do that. But for now, let's go over to Joel for his initial remarks.
Thank you, Simon, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with this group about these issues. You know, we're dealing with the leaked preliminary of the CBAM, if that's what we can call it, and there's supposed to be a coming out next week. Let me just say a word about the structure. It requires certificates that refer to the actual carbon emissions that are caused by production for imports, and then the payment of fees for those certificates. One thing I thought when I considered this is that this EU imposing an extraterritorial, unilateral, and perhaps coercive measure. And having said that, I think it's the right thing for the EU to do at this. It does provide an incentive for other countries to charge a carbon price so that they can collect the money instead of letting the EU collect the same money, because there is a provision in this draft that says the amount required to be paid will be reduced by payment in the country of origin of carbon costs. There's also, and I'll speak more about this, a provision to conclude. It doesn't state what the parameters are by which those recognition agreements will be determined, what they'll say, what kinds of foreign programs will be recognized. There's apparently no export carbon border adjustment. That's interesting. It makes the Article 20 exception case a bit easier, but it also allows leakage in terms of EU exports. And the idea, let me just say one other background thing, is the idea of a border adjustment is to address leakage. As I've read briefly, there doesn't seem to be a lot of documentation of leakage from European trading, the emission trading system of Europe that began in 2005. And so that'll raise a question about necessity and about Article 20 defenses generally.
Simon said at the beginning, there's this
PPM issue, which is product and production process methods. And the idea is it's a question of whether this measure can survive the anti-discrimination scrutiny under National 3 and emission treatment Article 1. And in my mind, this has been a mistake in jurisprudence where like products focuses on competitive aspects of rather than on things like the regulatory interest, the pressing regulatory interest here. So there may be circumstances where high emission and low emission processes may not make products unlike for purposes of the MFN obligation. So that's one core issue here, and one that we can talk about with respect to developing countries and the second thing I want to say is that recognition regimes, whether autonomous by the EU or by agreement countries, will treat countries differently without reference necessarily to the actual characteristics of the products, and that may cause discrimination issues. And obviously, even if there's a discrimination problem under MFN or national treatment, there's the possibility an Article 20 exception. So just to say a little bit more about the MFN issue, we've got the Belgian family allowances case from 1952, which is similar in some ways to this recognition issue here, where the panel, the panel at that time, didn't reach a very definitive conclusion, but said this is against the principles of the GATT at that time to distinguish by reference to national programs in the exporting state. And then there's a possible Article 20 defense, but there's also the question of the chapeau of Article 20 and the question of whether a recognition regime would be arbitrary or discrimination. So we would have to look at the conditions imposed by the European Union for its recognition, whether it treats Switzerland or Iceland or Norway differently from the way that it's China or the United States. And then just as we're speaking about of payment in other countries, talk about verification, and a proposal in Annex 3 talks about applying default values where the information about the amount paid and amount of carbon emitted is insufficient. Default values are set at the level of emissions of the 10% worst performing sites in the EU. So it's I would call that a possibly punitive kind of default value. And verification will be technically very difficult. Allocation of energy costs, we can expect strategic behavior by producers changing sources for certain products that are going to be exported to the EU and maintaining their overall level of emissions. Long value chains, difficulties in auditing. This is a large set of problems, and the EU, I think, should seek, well, under the 1996 gasoline case, the appellate body said that countries in the position of the EU should seek cooperative arrangements with exporting states, and in that case, it was the United States and Venezuela and Brazil, or audit or verification prior to applying default values. I should stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. So we had skipped Chiara because she was having technical difficulties, but she's back now. So now let's go. We're a little out of order, but that's okay. We'll go to Chiara for some background and the rationale for the EU CBAM. So Chiara, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
It's a little quiet on my end, but I mean, I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, maybe better
Yeah,
now.
that's good. That's
okay.
good. Yeah.
Okay, great. And thank you very much, and apologies for the technical issues. So yes, first I would like to present myself. For those who don't know me, my name is Chiara Galiffa. I work at the European Commission, DG Trade. I've been working in the team preparing the CBAM proposal. From the legal side, I'm now in the strategy unit, so I deal more with the policy issues. Yes, my presentation is a bit more focused on the background and the rationale of the CBAM. And here I would like to introduce the issue starting more from a broader perspective. As you know very well, we are in a very critical moment today where we need to provide the responses to the climate and the biodiversity emergency. And the choices that, of course, we will make today will influence the way that we live, we produce, and we consume for the next decade. The moment that we are living now will also determine whether we are on path to achieve the Paris Agreement objectives. And the EU, in this respect, has decided to take a very strong direction and has decided to lead by example. So we have set very ambitious targets for ourselves to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 and to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And this is not just an aspiration. We are trying to make this very concrete now in our regulatory framework. So as you know, the Commission adopted a Green Deal communication, which is a bit the chapeau of all the green initiatives which are likely to come now. And we will start this on 14th of July. We are adopting a very ambitious package of more than 10 proposals, which are all interconnected with each other and have the same objective, which is to drive the economy towards a green transition. These are proposals that range across various policies and various sectors. So climate, energy, fuels, transport, etc. And the CBAM is part of this package. So the CBAM is part of the package together with various measures and together in particular with the strengthening of the emission trading systems. So what is the CBAM and why do we need it? First of all, the CBAM is an environmental tool, is a climate measure, and its purpose is essentially to preserve the integrity and the effectiveness of our internal climate measure. In particular, I'm referring to the EU ETS, which sets very stringent targets now for the reduction of emissions. So the way the CBAM will work is that it will ensure essentially that the price of imports reflects accurately the carbon content, and so that it will production, but also imports pay a price that reflects their carbon content. So it ensures basically that that an equivalent price signal apply both to the carbon content of domestic product and that of imported products. So the reason why we need this, it's not just a question of fairness. The main purpose of the CBAM is essentially to address the problem of carbon leakage. And so by doing so, the objective is to reduce the carbon emissions globally. So this word carbon leakage is very often used. So what does it mean? So as I said, the EU has a high climate ambition, as it is also increasing that further with this new package. Problem is that not all countries have the same ambitious targets for the moment. So the risk is that if we increase our targets, essentially our companies will leave the EU to relocate in countries in other countries which have less ambitious policies. And by doing so, they will increase their emissions abroad. So the purpose of preventing carbon leakage is to prevent that our companies increase emissions abroad, and by doing so, they defeat what we're trying to do in the EU. So the concern is not just companies moving abroad, but the concern is that by doing so, the level of emissions will increase. And of course, the CBAM also has possibly the effect to contribute incentivize our importers in third countries to improve the efficiency of their production. But this is not the main objective. I mean, the main objective remains to preserve the integrity and the effectiveness of the EU emission trading system. What we have, the way we have constructed the CBAM from the very beginning at a very clear direction, as President von der Leyen also stated from the very beginning, it has to be designed in a way to respect the WTO rules and to respect our trade agreements, our international commitments. So this is an absolute red line. And so since the very initial phase of conception of the measure, we have been working very hard with colleagues in other services of the Commission, in particular TAXUD, who is the service leading on this proposal, to design an instrument that would be WTO compatible. It is, of course, complex, it is challenging. There are several aspects to be taken into consideration. And we had initially various options on the table. We had the option of an import tax or an excise duty or a system that would replicate the emission trading system. Now, of course, the political decisions are taking place now as we speak. So decisions are still to be made. But as you know, the preferred option is the one that mirrors the EU ETS. So the system has been constructed as a mechanism that completes the ETS architecture and essentially tries to extend the regulatory framework that we have under DTS on imports as much as possible, because of course we are dealing with two different environments. One applies to installation, the other applies to products. So there are unavoidable differences, but the idea is to replicate the internal regulatory framework on the imports. So that's the main construct behind the CBAM. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chiara. That's very helpful background. So let's go over to James now to talk about some issues related to transportation and freedom of transit. James.
So thank you, Simon. It is a great privilege to be part of this elite panel. In fact, I think the discussion so far has actually focused on some of the WTO related issues. Obviously, when a carbon tax is going to be imposed, will it actually lead to a duty in excess of the bound rate? And if any country wants to actually impose a measure as a border adjustment, then it is actually compatible with Article 2 and Article 3. Then can it actually lead to some other violations as well? So these are some of the legal issues, but I would like to touch upon an issue, which is the old ETS matter. Of course, we know that in the aviation sector, ETS was actually introduced in 2013. And of course, the measure has, I think, come up against some stiff resistance. So the one context which I want to put in place is actually the recent decision of the European Parliament. I think it came up in 2020, in October 2020, that actually seeks to control emission with respect to shipping. So when we think about the aviation sector and the shipping, they are very similar. But in the context of the aviation sector, the kind of economic impact of having an ETS was fairly, I think, underestimated or might not have been that big. But think about shipping. I think shipping is actually the pillar for international transportation. And if any country is going to impose an ETS or a CBAM in the nature of, carbon duty, then it can be problematic. So I do not really want to even undermine for a minute the importance of having a CBAM and these kind of measures. Let me just give an example to you. Being from India, let me actually think about an example where a ship is going from Mumbai, the western part of India, to Rotterdam in Europe. It actually covers nearly 7,500 nautical miles. And when it comes back after a voyage, it comes to around 15,000 nautical miles. And the extra cost of this kind of an emission trading system will come to around, 300,000 euros. So we have to actually look at some of the cost implications of this kind of a measure as well. The immediate cost implication. Some of the domestic, some of the exporters may have to change their shipping lines, but it is not that easy to choose a less polluting ship. I mean, these kind of shipping lines are well established in this particular route, and the domestic exporters will have to continue to rely upon them. So choosing a much more energy efficient ship is a difficult thing. So leave that particular issue for a minute. Let me actually come to some of the WTO implications of that. So with respect to some of the other ETS mechanisms, the European Union has actually given some kind of a free allowance. So when it comes to shipping, it is absolutely not clear whether the allowances will be free. And if it is not actually going to be free, then obviously the kind of criticism is that it is basically used as a subsidy in order to fund some of the COVID-affected domestic sector. So I think the focus is from addressing the carbon challenge to a revenue mobilizing activity. So that is actually one particular concern. The second is, when we look at the article, the other provisions of WTO, even Professor Joel Trachtman mentioned about the discussion centering around Article 20. So I'm just focusing on Article 3 of the GATT. So the one interesting issue is that this is not actually a product regulation. This is not an internal measure. But if you really look at the nature of the measure, in every sense of the term, it actually creates a detrimental impact on the foreign parties, which I mentioned cannot actually change their shipping line. So in all practical sense of the term, it is actually creating a less favorable competitive conditions within the market that is actually imposing the measure. So these are challenges actually. So maybe it may not be WTO law in this matter, but that is definitely a challenge. The other implication is basically from a point of view resulting from Article 11 of the GATT. We know that it is not actually strictly a quantitative restriction in that sense, but even if you impose some kind of a ETS mechanism on the shipping industry, then obviously it can actually amount to the cost being transferred to the exporters, and it can have some kind of a limiting or a restrictive impact on the foreign good. So to an extent, it can actually have some kind of an implication, a restrictive implication or a limiting implication on the other party. The next issue which I want to touch upon is basically the transit. So if you look at Article 5 of the GATT, the provisions relating to transit is not very clear, but obviously I think it is fairly clearly stated within the agreement that no contracting party or WTO member shall actually create unnecessary barriers or duties which are actually in the nature of transit duties. One of the major concerns here is that Europe is a major, and Europe and obviously UK and other countries are major transit hubs. So if this kind of a mechanism is actually imposed in the shipping industry, it can have a very somewhat of a serious kind of an impact on the foreign parties, especially countries which are actually relying upon the not so well energy efficient shipping sector. So these are some of the concerns which I want to highlight in this particular discussion. So and again, I think I don't want to talk much about this issue. Within the next 1 minute, I just want to talk a little bit about the carbon tax as well. So when we think about the carbon tax again, I think most of the focus is actually on using the PPM debate. So when you actually use a particular energy of production, then the two products may not be alike. But one important issue I would like to flag here, that is actually the nature of occult taxes. So if you look at the 1970 border tax adjustment, there was actually divergence even 50 years ago. In 1970, there was actually divergence. And I don't think that we have moved that far away to have some kind of a convergence, especially with respect to imposing a duty product that hasn't actually come through the formal customs boundaries, the customs frontiers. We can argue that, pollution doesn't know any border. That is true. But the carbon has been emitted in a foreign country. It hasn't even come to the importing country. But in order to actually, disincentivate a particular practice, I think some countries are actually resorting to a carbon tax. So my own feeling is that, think about countries, we have got a 2015 Paris Agreement. That agreement is actually well suited to reducing carbon emission through a cooperative effort. And that was what Joel Trachtman was actually referring to. So when a country, if one or two countries actually go for a unilateral measures, then everyone will be constrained to impose similar retaliatory measures. Well, that may not be good. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. Okay, so finally we'll turn to Thomas, and then we'll get into some Q&A discussion. So Thomas, go ahead.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for inviting me, and good day to everybody tuned in into this session. Debating the relationship between CO2 emission reductions and WTO can be done in two ways. One way is to ask whether measures are compatible with WTO, and that's what Joe has alluded to, and James has alluded to, and we may further add that they're probably, in my assessment, the main issue will be a subsidy question, as long as the certificates are freely available within the EU. And the other approach is what Tatiana asked, and I'd like to follow up on this. What can the WTO actively contribute to climate change? And I'd like to recall just three elements of paradigm shift. The first one is climate change is a common concern of humankind. This is a new notion in international law, which involves cooperation, it involves making your homework, it involves also compliance measures. But the main fact is that we all share an interest of abatement wherever it takes place, outside of our borders or within our borders. It doesn't matter, and that's a fundamental shift. And secondly, I'd just like to read the preamble of the WTO, where it says, while allowing for the optimal use of the world's resources in accordance with the objective of sustainable development, seeking both to protect and preserve the environment and to enhance the means for doing so in a manner consistent with their respective needs and concerns at different levels of economic development. I think this, in the context of biodiversity and climate change, this preamble will have an influence of how we see issues of non-discrimination, to which Joe referred to, and in particular in assessing the PPM question. And in my view, the PPM question is a fundamental paradigm shift. We have substantial case law on this already, showing that PPM distinctions essentially can be done if the measures is properly designed. And what I would like to propose is now to go back to the origins of GATT and ask, what can the tariff system contribute to climate, to CO2 emission reduction? The CBAM is a very peculiar instrument because it is linked to the ETS, and not every country has an ETS emission trading system here. Few have. We have to think hard, how can we design measures in the WTO which are practical, which is suitable for all members in the world, whether or not they have such specialized systems or not. And what I would like to propose is to review the role of tariffs. Now, the paradigm, of course, has been to reduce tariffs. Economists have told us you should reduce tariffs, get rid of tariffs. We still have them on agriculture, it's bad, etc. So it's a one-way street. But at the same time, tariffs are very transparent instruments of taxation. And the question is, how can we use them to create incentives for CO2 emission abatement here? And so here the proposal would be that we use tariffs to essentially impose import burdens on products, commodities, which are produced in a non-sustainable manner. And these are, of course, not complicated products, but commodities with a simple structure, which don't go through a big value chain. Aluminum, steel, cement, perhaps electricity, which clearly you may be able to identify how it's being produced. And if it's produced in a non-sustainable way, the tariff would be high. If it's produced in a sustainable way, the tariff would be zero or low. So the distinction on the product will be made on the basis of a PPM, the way it's being produced. And moreover, you may link it as an incentive to reduce the applied tariff to the extent that the country operates a CO2 tax within its borders in the same way as the CBAM proposal also does so here. I think the tariff is a simple instrument which could be used as a foundation for a multilateral approach in the field. We could have a carbon tariff initiative in the WTO. It could be multilateral. It could be also plurilateral. It is obvious that it takes more than one player to be effective in order to avoid diversions here. But I think we could develop an ambitious project to create a tariff, a CO2 emission club in the WTO on the basis of a multilateral initiative or on the basis of a plurilateral initiative, allowing all countries to participate and not only the leading ones with complicated ETS systems here to which the system has to react in some way or another. So to me, the interest is how can we develop a proactive agenda in the WTO on this? Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, I think I've heard related suggestions in the context of Brexit and the UK's new approach to tariffs. I've only followed it, at the margins, but I think that discussion has been going on there, not in relation to climate change, but maybe sort of the production of agricultural products and the animal welfare and those sorts of issues. Okay, so now we are at the discussion part of this roundtable. I want to point out, if people hadn't noticed already, in the public chat, there are some questions being thrown out there to specific people. So if any of the panelists want to take a look and see if there's anything directed at you, I'm looking at them as well. I'm going to try to incorporate some of these questions in the questions I'm about to ask. But what I'm going to do to start us off, and I know we are the Society of International Economic Law, so obviously law is a big part of what we're talking about. My first series of questions is, I think, a little more political, but that's okay. I think, even if we're not on as firm a ground as if we're talking about GATT Article 20, I still want to get people's reactions to some of these questions. And I'm going to go, I think Chiara might have a little difficulty being a government official answering these, so you're off the hook if you don't want to. But I think I'm going to go clockwise on my screen. So I'm going to go Tatiana, Joel, James, Chiara, and Thomas. And so my first set of questions is, so what is the likely reaction of the United States or China, or just to bring in the backgrounds of our participants, or Brazil or India or Switzerland, to a European CBAM? Would they challenge this at the WTO? Would they retaliate immediately? Will they be considering their own CBAMs? Are we more likely to see a trade war among the CBAMs, or a coordinated effort to use CBAMs harmoniously? And then one last question, I don't know how well it fits in here. Regardless of the reaction by foreign governments, is the EU CBAM likely to have a significant Brussels effect, causing foreign industries to comply where not strictly required? So let me start with Tatiana. Your reaction to any of that?
Sure. Well, thank you. Thanks for this. I'm based in China, and I've been following China's climate policies for a while. Well, of course, we know that China has announced this carbon neutrality goal for 2060, and then, specialists wonder how is that China going to, peak its emissions by 2030 and then neutralize its emissions by 2060. It's still moving up in the emissions, and then you have a very steep kind of slope to neutralize them. And one mechanism that China is counting on is this emission trading scheme that has been launched this year. And it basically builds on the experience that they've been accumulating for almost 10 years in 7 cities and municipalities. So now they put in place a national scheme building on these experiences in cities and municipalities. It hasn't started, trading hasn't started yet, but we know the basic features of the mechanism. And so in light of that, of course, we could wonder how may play out in the way that China reacts to the EU CBAM. Of course, and I think I should have started, I think maybe by mentioning that China has regarding the EU CBAM and WTO. I think it was in the Market Access Committee twice, also with Brazil, India, South Africa. China has voiced concerns again relating to, well, discrimination, protectionism, fairness, etc., etc. So China, on the one hand, seems unhappy. The largest exporter seems unhappy and worried with the development in the EU, but at the same time is developing its own, it's pursuing its own efforts in the area of an ETS, a national emission trading scheme. So if China is pressured, if its exports feel the impact in the EU, well, can China's emission somehow, I don't know, taken into account by the EU? I don't know. And then, well, if its exports feel the impact, or if its domestic production feels the impact of an emission trading scheme, will it be tempted to react by imposing a CBAM itself? Maybe not, I don't know. But what I think it is important to mention here is that China seems serious about it. The effort is huge. It's not easy. And the emission trading scheme is it's an important piece, I think, in this puzzle.
Thanks, Tatiana. Let me turn to Joel. Joel, as the American on this panel, do you have any sense of how the Biden administration or Congress might react to all this?
Well, Simon, you may know better than I. I understand that the Biden administration is having trouble developing a carbon tax. There's a fear that it would be regressive. And so Biden is moving slowly on that. John Kerry, the US ambassador for climate, has said that there are, quote, serious implications for economies and for relationships and trade in a carbon border adjustment. And he said it should only be considered as a last resort if all other options for reaching solutions for global decarbonization fail. This that James and I have raised, relationship between the WTO on the one hand and the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change and the Paris Agreement on the other hand. Biden's interested, if I suppose the United States imposes a border tax adjustment, and every United States carbon pricing proposal introduced in recent years has included carbon border adjustments. Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary, in 2020, the countries that introduced carbon border adjustments could form carbon customs unions along the lines that Thomas has described. And so it's something that I think raises interesting questions for the United States. It would be nice, I think, from my personal standpoint, if the United States could have a carbon tax. I think they're talking about an amount that's lower than the 57 euros per ton that's currently in the ETS. Whether there would be a trade war really depends on what these other countries see. And I think I want to go Chiara said, which I think is important. She said it's not just fairness, but also the carbon problem. So there is a dual aspect to the CBAM, and that is it is about fairness in the sense of protecting your competitors from an unlevel playing field, but it's also, and very importantly and crucially, about carbon reduction. And as I said at the outset, I think unilateralism in the service of appropriate action is the way the international system develops. And so it doesn't bother me that from a kind of substantive standpoint, not necessarily a technically legal standpoint, that this something that the European Union is doing. I think, but see in the proposal the success of WTO law in requiring, and I hope that this is followed through in verification and recognition arrangements, in requiring even-handedness in the application of this measure. So an even-handed measure will be politically attractive and will be one that other countries might move towards. There might be a Brussels effect in the sense that Anu Bradford described, in that companies will be induced in part to reduce their carbon for all of their production, not just their production that goes to the EU. As I said earlier, there's also the possible alternative strategic behavior by companies to simply shift their fuels for production for the EU and or other production, and so not change their behavior one bit. And that emphasizes really the need for more global in this area. Just one last word in terms of developing countries. I know people have asked in the chat about developing countries and the role of special and differential treatment. And of course, refers to common but different responsibilities. So there are principles of special and differential that are relevant here. The CBAM, as it's formulated, does not yet include that. The European Parliament said that there should be special and differential treatment for developing countries, but yet, and I think it will be interesting to see how that is done. Of course, there's this question with and others, what is a developing country for these purposes? Thank you.
Thanks, Joel. Let me turn it over to James now. James, I think some of your initial remarks, kind of dealt with in India's reaction to certain aspects of the CBAM, but just sort of more broadly, how does India see this? Is India going to be engaging in its own carbon reduction programs of some sort? How will they react to what the EU is doing here?
So I think for anyone familiar with India's position in multilateral trade negotiation, India was always actually against using PPMs as a method of distinguishing products. So that has a long history, but I personally feel that the carbon tax is an idea whose time has come. But the issue is that there are multiple ways of actually doing a more cooperative efforts in tackling this particular issue. While coming to India in particular, it is worth, I think, pointing out that India is actually one of the major members of the Paris Convention that have achieved significant progress in cutting down emissions. So if you look at the climate change tracker, India is very much within the green zone and is poised to achieve the reduction commitments by 2030. So on that particular point, India has been doing well. And most of you know that India has got a national solar mission program. India is actually part of the National Solar Alliance. So there are so many domestic policies which are taken in order to cut down the carbon emission. But at the same time, I should also mention that in India, I think, India is a vast and, a country with a huge amount of differences. So within India, you can find a large number of enterprises who may be actually using the best technologies. So if you look at the steel sector, some of the companies may be using more cutting edge technologies. But at the same time, you will also find some of the old companies which may be having a very old technology. So it actually differs from companies to companies. But during this particular time, especially when the global demand in many products have actually come down, when most of the industries are actually going through some kind of a stress, and that the governments have actually withdrawn some kind of a subsidy or industrial subsidy, my own feeling is that this may not be the right time to come up with a carbon tax policy, because the timing may not be that good, because the world is just trying to cope up with the corona crisis. But at the same time, I feel that if there is a better area, then it is possible for India not to come up with a CBA mechanism. But my own feeling is that if a unilateral action is taken by other countries, then obviously the natural choice will be to come up with an own CBA mechanism. maybe in this particular area, countries actually retaliating on based upon a CBM may be good for everyone, because everyone is trying to actually cut down carbon emission. But my own feeling, it will be a huge blow to cooperation. And this is one area where many countries are actually on the same path. As Professor Joel mentioned, this is the last option, where are absolutely not available. So my feeling is that India may not immediately come up with a CBAM, but if there are unilateral actions, then it might.
Thank you, James. I'll turn to Chiara now. As I said, I understand you may not be able to say much here, and that's fine. Just let me know. I mean, I guess I'll just put the question to you. What reaction do you expect, and are you hoping for from other governments? And you can answer that or not, depending on what you're allowed to say.
Thank you very much, Simon, for the question. I think, as you say, it's a bit difficult for me to speculate at this stage on the position that other countries will take, that the US or China will take, and where they will land. As I said at the beginning, our efforts have been focused on designing something which is WTO compatible. So we hope, we trust that there will not be litigation on this. But of course, if for different reasons other countries take a different view, they will have to resort to litigation. So if they resort to immediate retaliation, this will be contrary to Article 23(2) of the DSU. So they need to go to dispute settlement, and then we will have to see there. On the questions that you raised on the Brussels effect, this is very interesting. I think we will have to see how the international community will react. But I think, if the common objective is to reduce climate change, and countries have been taking they've been taking international commitments of this, then what we would expect to see is that naturally the producers will move to a greener production method, and this will not just be a result of what the EU is of the regulatory framework that the EU is setting up. This will be part of a general movement towards green transition. And of course, the more there is international action, the less there will be an interest on the CBAM, because as I said at the beginning, the CBAM is there because we don't all have the same ambition at the moment. So we need to preserve what we're trying to do within the EU through this kind of measures. But I think also we need to be realistic. The EU is moving now to take a number of autonomous measures, but there is only so much that the EU can do alone, because of course there are the emission in the EU are only part of the problem. So the real answer to the problems that we are facing today will come only from international cooperation. And so that's our hope. We are, of course, taking a number of autonomous measures. It's not only the CBAM, but in the future, there are more in the pipeline under the Green Deal. But they're all with the mindset that we need to leave space for cooperation with third countries. This will be very important. And also in the CBAM, there are mechanisms embedded in the system that allow to recognize the efforts of other countries, or that allow for international cooperation. This is very important because we don't need to we need to preserve also the efforts we are making at the international level. There have been several ideas that have been flagged around about the climate clubs, etc. These are all in principle good ideas, but I think also what is important is that we cannot wait for when the concern is so important and global. We cannot just wait and see. We need to take urgently action, and so that's why we are advancing with our climate ambition, and that's why we need to preserve that through measures like the CBAM.
Thanks, Chiara. So finally on this issue, let me turn to Thomas. I mean, you can offer your thoughts on how Switzerland might react, or just sort of more generally how you see the world reacting to this. Sorry, Thomas, you're muted.
Okay, thank you, Lester. Well, I think from the EFTA point of view, it shouldn't be too much of a problem because these countries are linked to the European ETS system and they will not be affected by particular measures here. With respect to the other countries, I'd like to introduce another element, I think, which is crucial in all these issues. This is transfer of technology. I think if you take measures which privilege products which are produced in a sustainable manner, you in all fairness, you have to make available the technology to all countries that they can shift their production to sustainable means here. This is not only an issue of fairness, this is also in the very interest of climate change emission abatement. As I said at the outset, it doesn't matter where it takes place in the world. Now, transfer technology to a large extent works with licensing if there is sufficient funding available, but it breaks down when the funding is not available, and that's the case with many developing countries and least developed countries. So a proactive agenda of technology transfer has to be developed. And in the WTO, we're nowhere on that. We have Article 66.2 of the TRIPS agreement, which entails an obligation to provide transfers to least developed countries, but that has not materialized for the simple reason that governments do not dispose of the technology in the private sector. And so we need to think hard about incentives to these companies to provide the technology. We can think about tariff cuts, tax cuts on this. But we can also think of a program where the income from the border tax adjustment measures or the tariff measures would be specifically used to fund technology transfer programs to developing countries here. It gets me to the question. I see that Peter van der Bosch put a question about the PPM question, whether that is sufficiently solid or whether we need to change the case law. In my view, I think the case law is sufficiently solid on PPM, non-product related PPMs if the measures is adequately shaped. It's always a matter of details, but politically, and James said it, that India has been against PPMs because the political deal is one-sided, and what is lacking is the transfer of technology side. If we combine PPMs, non-product related PPMs, with transfer technology, the thing looks different here. So in this carbon club, we would design there has to be a mechanism of effective transfer of technology, and that also would inform the renegotiations of tariffs, which Lotte Ehring asked to. Hi, Eric, Lotte, and which would be essentially a part of the deal in terms of the concession you make in rescheduling tariffs for highly polluting products here.
Thomas, and you've demonstrated that there's an awareness here of these questions being in the public chat. That's great. I encourage all the panelists when they're not speaking to look through them and see if there's anything you want to respond to. What I'm going to do now is ask one more kind of series of questions, and then I'll start try to pick off the ones in the public chat that haven't been answered and put them out. So the next kind of grouping of questions relates to the role of the WTO here, and we start by asking about the WTO dispute settlement system. Can the WTO resolve disputes over CBAMs, keeping in mind that the dispute settlement system is not currently functioning very well? Is it plausible to think that WTO litigation really will provide us a resolution here? What are the various WTO agreements that are implicated? We've talked about some of those. What are the chances of success on WTO claims? And then beyond litigation, Can discussions in WTO committees help? Is a broader negotiated agreement possible? Yes, the environmental goods agreement is out there. Maybe we sort of have an EGA plus that does more than just lower tariffs. So just to mix up the order a little bit, I'm going to start with Joel. I'll go Joel, James, Chiara, Thomas, Tatiana on this one. So Joel, if you want to take the plunge and.
Thank you. At least for the United States and for many countries, the appellate body is in a coma. So I'm not sure how dispute settlement would solve problems. If the appellate body is resuscitated, as I hope it is, it's possible to police non-discriminatory structures. So if the verification arrangements or recognition arrangements are discriminatory, they could be policed. We have these questions that have already been raised of whether differentiation on the basis of carbon intensity would amount to discrimination in the national treatment or MFN sense. And I think under current jurisprudence, they would. But I think there's a strong argument for Article 20B or 20G. What I think is an interesting problem is this inconsistency, as James mentioned, with the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, it's not very binding. It's a strange agreement, but it sets a line of equilibrium, if you will, under the shrimp turtle case, where the appellate body said, where there's this other international law that sets a line, that's the test for arbitrariness under the chapeau. And so I fear that if there is a challenge, there may be some question about whether this CBAM, benevolent as it is, with one caveat, is defensible. The caveat, which I do want to mention, and it relates to something Thomas said, is that under the CBAM, the money goes to the EU. And it seems to me that, if you're saying that other countries can charge their own carbon price and will subtract that, but if they fail to, maybe because it's difficult administratively, we're going to just collect that money for ourselves. And I think that's something that's unfair to developing countries, and that money should go to developing countries instead of being kept by the European Union. I do think that the WTO system and the GATT system, if you will, which began in 1947, wasn't really designed for these kinds of global problems. And dispute settlement is not the right forum. And as you suggested, Simon, the WTO committees or the UN framework on climate change or some other political forum is the place to do it. But that political forum should not any longer be hampered by the need for consensus or unanimity. As Chiara said, we need urgent action, and the international legal system as it's set up is inconsistent with urgent action for this kind of global public good. And so that's why I'm glad that the European Union is taking unilateral action, even if it's colorably questionable under WTO law, because I think it is, with that one exception I mentioned, even-handed. And I hope that it will induce multilateral action. Thank you.
Thanks, Joel. James, do you want to weigh in on the WTO's role here in litigation, negotiation, committee work?
I think Professor Joel actually mentioned it pretty well. But my own feeling is that, this is not actually a matter that should be resolved through a WTO dispute. It will end up as actually one of the reports that has been appealed to the void as well. It can further slow down the restoration process of the appellate body. So if you look at this issue, it definitely requires a unilateral, a universal cooperation. And as Professor Thomas mentioned, one of the major challenges will be the transfer of technology. So when we really want to come up with a measure of this nature, many developing countries will have to bear significant amount of cost in complying with the requirement of CBAM, and they will have to invest heavily as well. So if technology takes a huge amount of time for transfer, then of course it will again create some kind of a suspicion about this particular project. And it has been mentioned in the discussion as well. If the CBAM money is actually going to create a fund that can help the developing countries, perhaps it can actually meet the requirements of a good faith. But if it is going to be given to the European industry to gain back competitiveness, then it can further get into trouble. So again, I think one shouldn't lose focus on the fact that most of the developing countries are actually together in this matter, because if you look at the tropical, actually the victims of climate change, and so in principle, they are actually with the countries who really want to come up with a CBAM kind of a measure. But my own feeling is that any kind of a unilateral measure will completely take away the good faith, the goodwill associated with this kind of initiatives. So I will stop here, but I don't think that the matter should definitely go to a WTO for resolution. It will be one of the unresolvable matter, and obviously the members of the WTO will be on different sides in this issue.
Thanks, James. So Chiara, again, the caveat that, I understand if you can't say much or anything on this, but do you have anything you want to add on the role of the WTO here in terms of either litigation or committee oversight or negotiations?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I think here, as the EU, we continue to believe in the dispute settlement system of the WTO. And as you know, we have put forward a number of proposals for the reform. We have sponsored the creation of the MPIA. And so in our view, if there is a dispute, and you cannot anticipate that because, of course, it's in the hands of the others, the dispute settlement system will be and should be able to handle such a dispute. But obviously, the dispute settlement system only deals on questions of consistency with WTO law. And here, I think we have a much broader societal issue at stake, which is that of climate change. So we need to work to resolve these challenges, and I think the forum where we can do that is mainly the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. But obviously, that does not detract from the fact that we can have discussion, and we should have discussions in the WTO on how trade can help that green transition. And trade already in itself plays a very important role on climate change, because it can help the efficient allocation of resources. It can help circular economy. It can help the diffusion of green products. But it is true that, as I said before, the most effective actions that we can take to resolve the problems are at multilateral level. So WTO has an important role to play. We have now a WTO ministerial conference upcoming, the MC12. We hope that this could be a stepping stone to launch a discussion on trade and environment in the WTO. We have also other initiatives ongoing. There is a trade and environmental sustainability structure discussion ongoing that gathers together several WTO members, including the developing ones. So we hope that this will converge towards working on a common problem, program to identify priority areas of discussion in the WTO. There are several ideas that have been put out there. There are several things that we could do. It's not only liberalization of green goods and services to foster climate mitigation, but there is more that you can do. For instance, fostering the transparency in the WTO on measures that the members plan to adopt on reaching climate transition. There is also a question on transparency on subsidies. There is work that can be done in greening the priorities set in the Aid for Trade work program. So there is a lot that we can do, and I think we need to empower the WTO with a climate agenda, because this is such topical issues, and the WTO needs also to get involved in on that. Perhaps if you give me the opportunity, because I see that many times the issue of the developing countries has been raised. And I think what I want to stress here is that it is a bit premature to say how the CBAM will impact on the developing countries, because there are still discussions ongoing on what sectors will be covered. But the EU is very conscious of the impact on developing countries, and we need to remain very attentive to the needs of the developing countries. And this is also one of our objectives. Often I see that the discussion is focusing very much on why don't we give an exemption to LDCs or developing countries. But I think there is also more that can be done. These countries need financial support. They need help to promote climate projects. They need capacity building. So there is a whole range of actions beyond just giving a simple exemption that can be taken to help them, and we need to remain very attentive on that, because obviously the objective is always the same, that we need to pursue the climate ambition in a cooperative manner. We cannot do that alone. So even if the CBAM, the revenue of the CBAM would end up in the EU budget, but it will just make the EU budget bigger, and so that means that the EU would have also more money to devote to projects which is already financing in the LDCs or developing countries. So it means the EU will have more money to help the countries to move towards the green transition.
Thank you, Chiara. Thomas, your thoughts on the role of the WTO and its various different aspects of its role?
Well, I'd like to echo much what Chiara said. I think the dispute settlement system is able to handle the issue. I recall that the panel stage is fully operational, making excellent detailed analysis. And then on the appeal level, the European Union is a member of the MPAA, and 23 other members may use the system to clarify further this issue. I think that will help to clarify scope for such programs here. But of course, this is only one angle, and the other angle is really to develop a proactive negotiating agenda here. And we cannot simply start from carbon leakage. We have to take a broader view on this here. We discussed a number of elements today, but we also would need to include fossil fuel subsidies. The reduction of fossil fuel subsidies is a topic for which the EU is, for which the WTO is most suitable in light of the experience with the fishery subsidies, but primarily with agricultural subsidies. So we know how to do this and in the long run, and why don't we have an agreement on that? We need an agreement on interfacing electricity, sustainable electricity, to working towards a component of a global grid. These are trade issues comparable to ones with gas interlinkages, which we litigated upon between Russia and the EU and things like that. So I think it's really a creative moment, and I recall that we have a paradigm shift. We really need to think out of the box newly and to sit down and see what could be done and get out of the reactive mode, which of course is important in dispute resolution, into a proactive mode in designing a negotiating agenda which really takes into account all the elements which we discussed today.
Thank you, Thomas. And finally, we'll conclude on this issue with Tatiana.
Thank you. Maybe I start by echoing Professor Cottier's comments. I think it's high time we go beyond this my climate, your climate issue. Basically, it's how
which frankly doesn't help in light of what we're facing today.
And I find fascinating the topics that Professor Cottier mentioned in a kind of a carbon tariff initiative or carbon initiative in the WTO. Other issues such as fossil fuels could be part of the mix. Of course, I can think about many issues, difficulties, challenges. But I think we need to be bold and think about bold solutions as well. For example, okay, SDT, like, oh, how we address that? Come on. Address this over time in the trade facilitation agreement in a certain way, in plurilateral agreements, in the expansion of the information technology agreement in a different way, and this hasn't stopped members from reaching agreements. So it's very easy, you know, just to identify all the problems we would face. Of course, we have very serious problems, but we need to be serious about it and bold about the solutions that we
devise, you know, to
address the. Having said that, I think you know. The discussions about environmental goods now, as in comparison to where we left them a few years ago, just before Trump was elected in the US, I think we're in a much more challenging environment, frankly. I think this green tech competition between China and the US makes it more challenging, even more challenging for an agreement. I don't know, maybe Professor Trachtman would help me on that, but my view is that it can be very challenging for the US to eliminate tariffs on some of the products that had been part of the. So the scenario, even if there's an alignment in terms of the US, EU, and climate goals, this economic tensions between the US and China, and frankly China and many other players, make it even more challenging for some of them to eliminate tariffs on green technologies. On litigation, I think it's been said what the EU is not off the hook. The multi-party interim arbitration agreement would still apply, and we have and Brazil, who have been raising questions about the consistency of the EU CBAM with WTO rules. So, I mean, that is a possibility that it ends in this period. I would agree with the others that would not be the best way forward. As I mentioned, Brazil, of course, is a Brazilian national. Let me just say that I didn't mention Brazil in my previous comments. Brazil is very worried, is very active, is working with others, including China, India, and South Africa, to better understand what's at stake, what potential implications are in Geneva, in Brasilia, in Brussels. I think Brazil has a very clean, renewable energy.
The EU,
so if the EU is focused on energy-intensive, how does the fact that Brazil's generation, electricity generation, can be duly taken into consideration? I think there's this aspect, you know, of Brazil in particular, but I think overall Brazil is concerned with systemic interest, has concern with discrimination, the possibility of the system become a protectionist, high protectionist interests, etc., etc. So I would expect Brazil to be active on that. I know the private sector in Brazil is following that very closely. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. So if I understand our time constraints correctly, we have about 15 minutes or so before I have to end this. And in that time, maybe let's try to get to some of the questions in the public chat. It's good that some of you have been answering them either in the chat or in response when you were speaking. I have a very specific one here for Thomas from Lothar Ehring. Lothar asks, for your tariff idea, and to create water for WTO members with the lowest bindings, do you propose A, Article 28, B, a mini round to replace schedules by certification, or C, something else? And Thomas, I'll let you answer that one if you want.
Thank you. Well, Lothar, I think the Article 21 will be an important foundation if you want to move unilaterally with deconsolidation. And it would be then, of course, linked with the transfer of technology commitments, which I talked about earlier. More ideally, of course, would be a multilateral approach, a tariff round with everybody involved on these issues. And if that's not possible, it should be a plurilateral approach, but under MFN, so that everybody else would be able to join in if they want to here. One of the participants also asked about the downside of a plurilateral approach, whether that would still allow countries then to apply unilateral measures to non-club members. Yes, that would be the case, but that's also the incentive to join the club, to join the club in the first place. Simon, it's just my quest is simply to not to put all the experience on tariffs aside we have in the GATT over the last 50 years, and just to think through to what extent this instrument can actually help us to achieve the goals in a non-discriminatory manner, which we think. And most people on BTA have been obsessed with Article 2.2, and it was interesting to see that nobody really thought about tariffs, because we have been in the mood of reducing tariffs and its out-phasing model here. But I think under new paradigms, we just need to rethink how best we can use these tools here.
Let me raise a question now that I think maybe incorporates some of the elements of various different questions. So I'm currently involved in a debate in a law journal with some Americans who have proposed, let's say, maybe a confrontational approach to dealing with carbon. It's a particular version of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. What I said was the United States should consider subsidizing developing countries to help them along. So instead of this confrontational, we're going to impose a tax on imports, we're actually going to help you along by giving you money, transferring technology, as others have mentioned, because as people have mentioned in the chat, there's this sort of historical record of emissions, and the United States, the countries that industrialized first, look worse there. We've emitted more. Just because we've been emitting for a longer time. And so I guess my question is this idea of subsidies and transfer of technology from the wealthy countries, the United States and the EU and others, is this politically realistic? I guess this is sort of a question of internal politics, and anybody can answer it from any perspective. But so I'm out there saying the United States should subsidize developing countries to help them deal with carbon emissions. It's hard enough to think of the United States doing anything internally. Could I actually convince the U.S. government to do this? And so let me just put that out to you. You can answer it anybody can answer it from any perspective. Is it realistic to have a program of subsidization and transfer of technology from developed countries to developing countries? Anyone want to take that?
Okay, Lester, can I say a word about the experience on we had in Switzerland on CO2 legislation, which recently was rejected. And I think one of the reasons was that the charges which were put on the people, for example, for higher electricity or gas costs, etc., gasoline costs, were going just into the general budget of the federation. And I think one of the lessons is that when you charge services or goods for CO2 emissions, the return has to be placed in a basket where it immediately benefits those who were charged with others. And I think this is also true on the international level. So when CBAM revenues go into the federal into the EU budget here, I think that's not optimal. It should go directly into programs which are used to abate CO2 emissions abroad here. and then you get the direct linkage, and you don't get the politics of playing around with the money. It is earmarked for a particular purpose, and I think that increases the acceptability not only domestically but also internationally among those. And I think it's really the funding of these programs which is the answer to the differential treatment question here, because as I said, it doesn't matter where the aluminum is produced; it has to be produced in a clean way. Whether it's a production which was picked up 100 years ago or 50 years ago, it doesn't matter. It just has to change here, wherever it is. And so we have the funds earmarked for this.
Thanks, Thomas. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I just want to make a comment. Actually, we are having this discussion on using even subsidy mechanism. I was just thinking, we have got a provision even within the SCM agreement, Article 8, that decades ago. Why don't we actually use this opportunity in order to revive that mechanism and make sure that some of these programs given for environmental programs, for research and development, they don't get actionable. So I think that is the barest minimum we can actually do. We already have a mechanism within the agreement, just get it to reactivate it.
Thank you, James. Unless anyone else wants to weigh in on that, I'm going to move on to another question. So I see a question from Emily Lidgate. So I think that Thomas, you've answered. Thomas, you put forward your idea for PPM-based tariff distinctions, and Emily's question is, what are your views on the WTO legality of PPM-based tariff distinctions? And obviously, I think we know where Thomas is coming from there. The question is then for the others. I mean, do you have anyone have thoughts on? I mean, this is something I've heard mentioned in the context of Brexit and the UK thinking about tariffs tied to animal welfare standards. What does that look like as a sort of regime that others adopt in terms of WTO legality or good policy or its impact on the system? And any thoughts from anyone on that?
I had a question really for Thomas on this idea, and that is, I wonder what the advantage would be of a tariff-based club versus the CBAM itself. Is your idea that a tariff would be more administrable because you would just have a bright line as to what constitutes a sustainable production process and then charge the tariff or not charge the tariff without any further verification? Is that the advantage?
Yeah, Joe, I think the tariff would be a simpler system to administer and to run for most countries here. And we should not forget that the countries operating ETS systems as the EU or Canada are a small minority, and we cannot expect that all countries of the world are moving into that sort of rather complicated system here. And so I think that tariffs would essentially be simpler to run. I also would like to recall that I would propose to limit those really to very polluting commodities and not to go into value chain analysis. Even cars, I think, would be too complicated given all the inputs they today have to administer here. But if we're talking about cement or aluminum or steel or electricity, then I think that would be manageable. But let me give you one example which is quite interesting. In the recent EFTA Indonesia agreement, a PPM-based tariff differentiation was introduced for palm oil. So there is a contingent of palm oil which can be imported subject to verification that this is produced in a sustainable manner here. And the rest would be subject to higher tariff rates here. And so you start introducing these distinctions. It's of course linked to verification on the ground. You have to work with NGOs and the government, and it's a challenge to get this done. But I think in principle it can be done. I also like to recall that Article 2 of the GATT is also subject to Article 20. or the Article 20G exceptions can also be applied to tariffs, and the tariff system allows to use the 7th and the 8th digit for PPM-based distinctions here. So I think that could be done technically.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on the PPM issue?
I mentioned in the chat that I'm not sure we need to get to the PPM issue, and I feel that the jurisprudence is not definitive on the PPM issue, but I think the jurisprudence is quite clear that like products are determined on the basis of competitiveness, and that doesn't, unfortunately, in my judgment, leave room for regulatory distinctions that are not perceived sufficiently by the consuming public. So I think, you know, we have a problem under the anti-discrimination rules if the basis for regulatory distinction is not affecting competition sufficiently, and almost by definition it isn't. That's why we have regulation.
Joe, I agree with you that there is an issue within Article 3 analysis here, and I think the majority of people would think that you need to go into the analysis under the exceptions and meet the necessity or the relateness test, and that's also what developing countries insist upon, because I think the disciplines on non-product related PPMs are more stringent than if you try to solve this right within an Article 3 analysis where you would rely on consumer preferences, etc. But I think, I'm asking to you, when you look at the case law we have today with tuna cases or with the EU cases on imports of seals, that essentially the case law allows, basically by taking recourse to the exception for non-product related PPMs here in principle, and it then depends very much how the measure is actually calibrated, and most fail on the calibration because it can be done better, but the principle as such, in my view, stands.
So I think that's definitely clear in the TBT context. I'm not certain that it's clear in the Article 3 GATT context.
But how do you see the role of Article 20 on the PPMs?
I agree with you that Article 20 allows PPMs. The only question would be whether, and this is not definitively answered either, whether it allows extraterritorial protection. You no doubt recall that the appellate body in shrimp avoided answering that question. But I think here it's like the sea turtles, the carbon swims and travels to the rest of the world. And so it's not extraterritorial in that sense. Although, as I said at the outset, I am a little bit discomforted in reaching out and telling other countries how they must internalize carbon costs. And I think, you know, the WTO agreement wasn't set up for answering that enormous question through adjudication. But I think, having said that, there's a possibility, as you suggest, that an Article 20 defense might be available. Yes.
I just want to ask a question to the esteemed panel. Because, you know, if you look at most of the literature in this area, the focus is always on Article 20. So that actually gives an inference that this measure can follow the WTO obligations either under maybe Article 2.1 or under Article 3.4. So the one concern which I want to ask you, in the case of carbon-related border tax adjustment, there is actually a product which is basically carbon. So if you look at the normal kind of PPMs like the tuna dolphin PPM, or, you know, even the seal kind of a PPM, there is no there is no other product involved here. But here in this case, the carbon emission is purely based upon the emission of a byproduct. And I think that particular distinction is always missed in the ppm debate. And I feel that the WTO literature on this point does not really talk about a clear, tangible, measurable byproduct that has been given a value. And that is actually the basis for the complete adjustment, the border adjustment. So I just want to get some feedback here from the esteemed panel here on this point.
Perhaps if I can jump in also on this PPM discussion, which I find very interesting, and leaving aside the question about tariff reduction. But we often, when we think of PPMs, we immediately fall on Article 20. But I think we could, in principle, design PPM measures that meet Article 3. That it's designed in a non-discriminatory manner. If we have, for instance, an internal regulation that applies in the same way to domestic and imported products, and there is no less favorable treatment, perhaps we don't need to fall into Article 20. Of course, I mean, this is it's a very complicated thing, and it has to be done very carefully. But in principle, you could think of designing measures that are non-discriminatory from the start, and that in principle do not require recourse to Article 20. And then, of course, if we get to Article 20, I think if we have made an effort, at least design a measure which is non-discriminatory, that would help also to meet the requirements of Article 20.
Thanks, Chiara. I mean, just to respond, and I don't have a good answer to James's point, but I think it's an interesting one. I'm not sure that there is a parallel case out there where you're creating this waste product. I mean, I'm just not exactly sure what carbon emissions are and how we value them. I mean, obviously there's a cost to them, but maybe somebody can also then turn them into something better. I mean, I'm a little unfamiliar with the science of it all. So I do think that maybe makes these kinds of measures somewhat unique, and it would add an element to the legal analysis that we haven't seen before. I'm not sure we end up at a different result because of that, but it is something that somehow would be taken into account. And I don't know if any of the others want to weigh in on that, but I do think that is a distinction with these particular measures and this particular product. Something that we haven't seen before. At least I can't think of it off the top of my head. If there are no other thoughts on that, we are now at 8:45. I think we may have reached our limit. I haven't been specifically told that. I thought we were originally at 75 or 80 minutes, and I think we're past that. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Let me thank the panelists for all of their great contributions. Thanks to the audience for participating in the chat and asking questions. And with that, goodbye, everyone. Have a good rest of the conference, and hope you enjoyed our session. Thanks very much.
And see you next year. Okay.
Yeah. See everybody next year in person, hopefully.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning in. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.